Well, they get a 700-page book that is both I think a novel, a story, a narrative of the experience of the prisoners of war in Southeast Asia. And they also get an analysis, a documented analysis of what that experience was like and how well the POWs performed, not according to memoir renditions, but according to records, according to debriefings and reports, and a good deal of research material that we went through over a period of almost 10 years. So it's both I think, a fascinating story, as well as a comprehensive scholarly analysis and record of the performance of the POWs and their experience, as well as, to some extent, getting into the problem of the MIAs, but mainly the POW issue. Yeah. I work at the Pentagon. I'm in the History Office, in the Office of Secretary of Defense, which is a small office of about 3 full-time professional historians. We do history such as this, although normally not this type of history, more often a history of the administrative history of the work and the policies of the Secretary of Defense. And we also have an archival function, and we do papers and analyses for the secretaries and for other officials in the building. Troutman's, the quote from Troutman probably was in an after-action report that we had received, although Troutman was interviewed by my co-author, Fred Kiley, who knew Troutman personally. Troutman was one of the seniors and one of the senior ranking officers at the zoo, one of the camps that was located about 3 miles southwest of Hanoi. And the passage that you're referring to is one in which I think Troutman gives a good summary of the torture experience, particularly the rope torture, in which he describes how they were literally strung up from the ceiling with their arms kind of behind their back and cinched up to the point where their shoulders were almost dislocated. In some cases they would be. They would be put through this periodically in 2 or 3 sessions. And it was one of the worst of the tortures. Some were maimed in the process. Few got through it without giving up some information, without in some ways giving the enemy what he wanted. Altogether, about 800. There were 800 at least documented cases of POWs. There are a number of discrepancy cases where we're not sure if a guy was perhaps captured for a few hours and escaped. He may have been held just very briefly, caught in an ambush and got away immediately. Some of those are counted on certain lists, but basically about 800 altogether. They all describe it very similarly, the double jeopardy aspect. Coming out of it, you experience the same thing as you're going in it. Fred Kiley, the co-author, actually went through a version of that at Fort Belvoir. At their survival school here in the Washington area. I declined to do it, but Fred had heard so much about the rope torture that just to get the feel of it, as he said, actually underwent it and had very much the same sensation that Troutman describes. By all accounts, it was the worst of the many kinds of torture that they were subjected to. But curiously, some managed to get through as with all things with the POWs, what some found to be the worst case, others found to be more tolerable, and there were some who found other tortures to be more vicious and more difficult to tolerate. Between 1960, the so-called middle years, which were the most difficult ones, when the torture program was fairly regularly practiced to extract information and also for punishment purposes, most of the POWs had at least one session in the ropes. And later on, as you get toward the end of the captivity period, closer to homecoming, fewer and fewer of them would be subjected to the rope torture. But there were many others. Bud Day, who won the Congressional Medal of Honor, and who was as tough a nut as anyone over there, as tough a resistor, and had as much fortitude and strength as anyone. Bud Day had the most problem with what was called the kneeling torture, where they would simply have to kneel for long periods of time, often on a pebble or a stone. And as he said in his memoir, try that sometime for 4 or 5 hours and see what it feels like. And Day had more problems with that than with the ropes. Alvarez, of course, is famous as the so-called Old Man of the North. He was the first pilot captured over North Vietnam in August of 1964. So Alvarez would have been there almost a decade altogether. He came out in 1973. At this point, I think it's probably around 1966 or 67. Alvarez is being taken through the town. They often would take prisoners through on kind of a tour of either bombed out sites as part of the indoctrination process. They would take prisoners, quote, out on the town. Many of the POWs actually welcomed this as at least a change of pace from the monotony of being in their cell for all but 22 hours a day. But Alvarez in that photo shot is out on one of those, I think, tours around the city. Denton was one of the top-ranking seniors. He was captured early in the war in, I believe, 1965. Denton had a reputation, even among the seniors, as being one of the strictest and one of the staunchest in terms of his adherence to the code of conduct and requiring that the others adhere to it. And every now and then Denton will get into some conflicts with Stockdale and Garino and some of the others who had a slightly different interpretation of the code. But Denton was one of the toughest resistors. He was certainly one of the most admired POWs. He's the one who he's the first senior off the aircraft at homecoming and gives the address on the tarmac at Clark Air Base where he says, "God bless America." And Denton's contribution to the so-called TAP code, the TAP code was a system whereby the POWs communicated, and Denton contributed an important new nuance or aspect, the so-called vocal TAP code, whereby prisoners would be able to communicate not just by a tapping on the wall, but through coughing or sneezing, and which was very important because it was very easy to disguise that form of communication in a climate, in an environment in which everyone had either some form of malaria or some kind of coughing, some kind of either lung disease, from the chill of the winter or the dampness. And so these places sounded like tuberculosis wards anyway, the various compounds, but they were often coughing in a certain code that Denton had developed. Swindle was another one who would be considered a hardliner. He was a Marine. There are not as many Marines who were captured as naval aviators, of course, or Air Force airmen. But Swindle was one of the more prominent POWs in this middle period, underwent a good deal of torture. He's one of those who was a master of what's called the fuck you look that he would give the Vietnamese. He took absolutely no quarter from their guards. He would be, again, he'd have to rate, I think, as one of the toughest resistors. And of course, when he came out, became active in politics and eventually in the Perot campaign. Johnson, another one. You're going through what are considered many of the toughest POWs, most courageous, and ones who were able to withstand torture and interrogation as well as anyone. Johnson was a Air Force major, and one of those who ended up at Alcatraz. Alcatraz was considered the place where the worst offenders, the worst resistors were put. There were 11 of them that were placed in Alcatraz altogether. Sam Johnson would have been one of them. To get a ticket to Alcatraz, you had to be a difficult prisoner and a strong resistor. Interestingly, Peterson does not play a prominent part in the book. We don't mention him to any large extent, and for some reason you don't get a lot of reading on him in the after-action reports, but in interviews we know that Peterson was very much respected and admired by Sam Johnson and by the other tough resistors, so he too had a very strong record. Although he's one of those who's not mentioned nearly as prominently as Sam Johnson or Swindle or some of the others you mentioned in the book. Well, Stockdale, by all accounts, I think even when compared with Denton and the other leaders, probably the most respected of the POWs. Congressional Medal of Honor winner, who was willing to slash his wrists and kill himself before giving information on the communication system at Walla at the Hilton, and in this particular compound called Vegas at the Hilton. Also was very important in terms of developing a version of the code of conduct, a rendering of it, an interpretation of it that would be conveyed and communicated throughout the whole prison system, that was considered a reasonable, commonsensical approach to how much torture they would be, the men, the POWs could be expected to take, attitudes about, do you have to escape, do you have to try to escape even if it means risking your life and the lives of others. Well, the code of conduct, of course, which is what Stockdale's and for that matter other senior leaders' instructions are based on, is a rather short code of conduct based on it came after the Korean experience. The basic concept was stick to the big four: your name, your rank, serial number, date of birth. Stockdale developed something. It was a system called, he used the acronym Backus, which dealt with some of the main experiences that the POWs would face and how they should deal with those experiences. The B stood for bow, don't bow, at least not in public, in any kind of a televised public display where the North Vietnamese would be trying to show the Americans to be obsequious and in a submitted, submissive pose. The A stood for air, don't go on the air, don't tape, don't go on the radio, at least try your utmost not to. Take torture up to a certain point. If you can no longer withstand it without feeling you were losing a limb or your life, give something, but give something that would not be significant. Certainly don't betray any comrades, don't betray the organization system in the prisons or the communication system. The C stood for crime in this Backus acronym. Don't admit to any crimes. The K stood for kiss, which was don't kiss the ring if they offer you early release. If they appear to be magnanimous and are trying to pose as humane and lenient, don't thank them for that. And the important us, the unity over self, which was the basis of the whole system. And I should say that Stockdale was not the only one who contributed to this code. Denton contributed as well. At certain points, Stockdale would be out of commission, and Denton or Robinson Risner would be the senior in a particular situation at a certain time. And they'd also developed certain incremental additions to this code of conduct as to what was expected of the prisoners. And at the end, I should mention John Flynn, who was the top-ranking senior Air Force colonel, who was very important toward, in a later point in the captivity, in kind of consolidating this guidance and this code of behavior. Right. Well, in terms of the treatment, we make the point that, and we don't get into a lot of comparison, but we do make the point in the beginning where we try to put this in context that no wars have been hospitable to prisoners of war. And in some cases, the Korean treatment was, and even during World War II, was as brutal or more brutal than what was experienced by the prisoners in Vietnam. However, I think what was really significant here is the longevity. These guys were the longest held POWs in American history. So they were, this was over a decade, or during the course of a decade for some who were POWs, almost a decade. Alvarez, Floyd Thompson, Jim Thompson in the South, called the Old Man in the South, who was captured in '64 and who came out in '73. These were guys who POWs that underwent repeated instances of torture, and of course just having to withstand some very difficult conditions in terms of the climate, in terms of sanitation, hygiene, malnutrition over a period of time. So certainly they have to rank right up there with the guys who survived the worst abuses, and in particular the most difficult conditions over a long period of time. In South Vietnam, there were not so many prisons as simply locations, often jungle stockades. The captivity in the South was more of an itinerant, nomadic kind of captivity, where often just one or two prisoners in a cluster. Later on, more would be brought together. But during much of the period of captivity in the South, you did not have formal enclosed prison structures as such, as much as you had camps that would be moved every few days, and stockades would be set up with cages. And we make the point in the book, and I think one of the real contributions to the book is that we discuss not only the stories of the pilots at the Hanoi Hilton, but the experience of these, in many cases, lower-ranking enlisted men, Marines and Army enlisted that were captured in the South, and who had to go endure this itinerant captivity that isn't discussed in any other books, to our knowledge. And in many cases had in some ways, a lonelier, certainly, but also a more challenging experience, because they had to deal more with the elements, being outdoors, often in a jungle or a mountainous jungle location, where there would be leeches and scorpions and snakes, and having to deal with probably a more precarious food and water situation as well. So the guys in the South also withstood, the ones who survived it, tremendous adversity, as well as the better-known cases of the Dentons and the Stockdales in the North. Dengler was a naval aviator who was captured, I believe, in '65, somewhere in the fairly early, might have been '64, actually I think '65 probably, in Laos. And Dengler is an interesting case because there were very few POWs who got out of Laos alive. Even at the end of the war, at homecoming, only 9 POWs came out of Laos. Total number, well, we don't know. See, there's the big question about MIAs and the big mystery about how many were ever in the prison system really is in the case of Laos. We just don't know, because they were held singly in very isolated cases. They would be, one or two would be held in a cave, and we know a lot of guys went down in good parachutes. When there are at least 300 cases where guys were downed in Laos, appeared to be in a position to survive and to become prisoner. But we only know of 9 that came out in 1973, and several who escaped, including Dengler, along the way. Dengler had a phenomenal story, and it's told in a book that he's written. It's so phenomenal, a lot of the analysts who reviewed it were not sure of its accuracy, and partly because Dengler had been so dehydrated and may have been hallucinating and was not sure himself of exactly what he experienced. In any case, he did manage to get out. He managed to escape along with several others who were in this one group. He was the only one. Duane Martin was an Army helicopter pilot who joined Dengler in this escape, and we know that Martin died along the way when they encountered some, I believe it was villagers with machetes, and Martin was killed along the way. A very interesting case, and what remains a discrepancy case, is the case of Gene de Bruyn, who went out with Dengler and who has never been, his body's never been recovered. We don't know what happened to him. We just know that he didn't make it out. There were reports along the way that de Bruyn would be spotted in a certain site, a certain area in Laos, but he did not come out in 1973, and he's one of the remaining really intriguing discrepancy cases. De Bruyn's brother, Jerome de Bruyn, is a professor at the University of Toledo who has made it his life's work for the remainder of his life to try to get more information on de Bruyn. But we don't know what happened. De Bruyn didn't make it out, but Dengler did, and just apparently as he was on a mountaintop and had just about run out of food. He was eating frogs, he was eating leaves, and finally he was spotted by a rescue aircraft and taken out. Over 100 of the POWs, as well as many analysts with the Defense Intelligence Agency. We talked with a family of POWs, including some who did not come back. And also one interesting case, the brother of Al Brudno, who was one of two who committed suicide. Al Brudno killed himself after coming back. Very tragic case, one of the great heroes of the resistance, and a fine person who was unable to adapt to a broken marriage and some difficulty after he came back. So we talked to family members, we talked to many of the POWs. My co-author, Fred Kiley, did most of the interviews, and I should say that Kiley is I believe, the foremost authority in this country on U.S. POWs. Fred did most of the research for the work and has encyclopedic knowledge based on his interviews with the prisoners as well as his review of the literature. Fred did most of the research, in fact, over a period of almost 10 years when we started this project. I came along later in the game after Fred had actually started the project. Fred had gotten sidetracked by some other responsibilities at the National Defense University, where he headed up their publication program and their research program. I picked up the book from Fred. Fred had drafted a number of chapters, had done this massive research, and I did a good deal of the writing of the later chapters and worked with Fred to complete the drafts of the early chapters. Well, we hear that from time to time, and all I can say is that there was absolutely there were no constraints and no inhibitions on us at all, aside from the normal security review of sensitive issues that any author would have to be subjected to before that information could be published. No, Naval Institute Press is a private press, and in no way connected with the government. There absolutely is no official imprimatur. In fact, we've alienated as many of the members of the military as we've pleased with this book. I think it's a good test of the candor and the balance and the objectivity of it, is that some of the POWs like it, some don't. Some of the government officials think it's a terrific paean to the success and performance of the military, and others think we were too harsh. The ones that complain feel that there are a couple instances where they say we got a fact wrong, a date wrong, although to an amazing extent, most of them say we nailed it right on the head and we got it right. But there's some who will say, you didn't get this exactly right. There's some who feel that we were maybe a little bit too critical of their individual performance, didn't give them enough credit. I don't want to betray any confidences, but there were a couple who believed that we were not fair to them. We feel we were. We feel the memoirs sometimes are a little too self-serving, so we were careful to use the memoirs advisedly and to always base our conclusions on corroborated statement. Probably about 24 good memoirs. Many of them are superficial, but there's some excellent ones out there. Alvarez has a memoir that's pretty good. The best one to my knowledge is Jerry Coffey's memoir. Denton has one called When Hell Was in Session. Nick Rowe, who was another case of someone who just escaped from the South, in Rowe's case, has an excellent memoir called 5 Years to Freedom. There are about 24 of them out there. There are very few books about the POWs, very few books such as this which deal with the POWs of a non-memoir type and in any kind of a comprehensive way, and that deal with the South and Laos as well as with the North and with civilians. We also deal with about 60 civilians who were captured in this book. Right. They were routinely afflicted with dysentery, with worms. In the South, again, even worse conditions because of the lack of fruit and vegetables altogether. Beriberi, scurvy type of diseases. In the North, they did have at least occasional access to, even if it was rotten, some fruits and vegetables, pumpkin. One new arrival came and was delighted to see that there was actually some rye bread on his plate until he noticed that the seeds were starting to move. There was very little in the way of palatable food except during holidays and toward the end when they were being fattened up, so that at the time of release they would look better and would reflect the so-called alleged humane and lenient treatment that the Vietnamese had maintained that they had always extended. Fred Kiley, again, did most of the interviewing, and he would know better than I whether there were those who objected or rejected the opportunity to be interviewed. As far as I know, there was no one who turned down the opportunity. Fred was trusted because he was Air Force and had served in Vietnam. He had been an advisor there for the Vietnamese Air Force in 1968-69. Kiley knew a lot of the POWs. In some ways, Fred and I had there was a dynamic and a certain tension between us, where Fred was usually, in some of these cases where we were wondering how effective the guys were at resistance, or how staunch they were in their resistance, Fred would be sort of willing to give the guy the benefit of the doubt. I think I brought some detachment to the process of evaluating the POWs, some academic detachment. So I think it was a good balance between Fred's insider knowledge of these guys and my detachment. And I think that helped us to come up with a pretty good balanced and objective view of them. It was a fact of life, and in the South, in fact, the conditions of the food was so bad that oftentimes the Vietnamese themselves were eating this tainted stuff. Denton makes the point that at one point, one of the, I think it's Cat, who is the head of the prison system, North Vietnamese prison system, says, "Do you know you're eating shit?" And Denton, who was as tough as they come, would say, "Does it have any protein in it?" Somehow they adapted. They were able to do this. They were able to down this stuff and eat it with problems with disease. Some of them died from disease. In fact, there were about 100 POWs who died during the course of the captivity, during the course of a decade, and most of them from disease, dysentery, malaria, beriberi, food problems, and so stomach problems, rather than from torture. This was the condition. This was the. There was. I'm trying to think of another instance where, in fact, they would use fertilizer for their own garden, and they would later eat the food. They didn't have access to clean water, and oftentimes no water at all. So it was one of the elements that they had to deal with. Right. Well, the impact would vary. Usually when the Dellingers or the Haydens would come over there, the prisoners on the one hand would often be trotted out with trays of cookies and in a fairly nice circumstances that might get a break in terms of some decent food and a break from monotony. But at the same time, they were being exploited for the purposes of showing the humane and lenient side of the Vietnamese. And the Haydens and the others would go back to the United States and say that these guys are being treated fine. There's no reason for concern. So it was the effect of them being over there was to really enhance the propaganda campaign of the North Vietnamese. And it angered the POWs tremendously. Also, when they would hear Jane Fonda or Hayden on the radio spouting about the American imperialists and the Vietnamese being so humane and lenient in the treatment of their prisoners, giving the wrong impression. Risner had a real problem with Mary McCarthy. Robinson Risner, who was the Air Force lieutenant colonel, and along with Denton and Stockdale, one of the leaders of the POWs, one of the senior ranking officers. Risner's an interesting case because he was exploited probably as much as any of the senior officers. He would be trotted out for these interviews with the visiting journalist, and he would be asked to tape on the radio because he was well known. He had been the subject of a Time magazine article. He was an ace, Korean War ace, and they exploited him mercilessly. They even would trot Risner out for these early release ceremonies where they would release some of the POWs, and he became a part of the pageant. And of course, it frustrated him greatly, and he underwent tremendous, I think, psychological suffering, as well as spending a lot of time in solitary also during portions of his captivity. So Risner endured an awful lot, along with Stockdale and the other seniors. Many guys came out with injuries that never healed, back injuries, leg injuries, of course all kinds of scars and other effects. The ratchet cuffs were another very difficult thing for them to handle, along with the rope torture. Sometimes the degree, the severity of the torture would be inadvertent. The Vietnamese didn't realize that at times they were using some cuffs and manacles that had been used on Vietnamese prisoners. It tended to be had smaller wrists, and so these things tended to be a lot of smaller dimension. And so the Americans, even when these things would be clamped on and were not ratcheted, it caused tremendous pain that the Vietnamese didn't even realize. So using manacles and shackles that were often very constricted to begin with, because they were downsized originally to suit the dimensions of the Vietnamese prisoners, created pain from the beginning, and then these things would be ratcheted. That's a picture of, it's a matrix of what was called the TAP code, which was probably the primary form of communication. It's a 5x5 matrix of the alphabet, containing all the letters except the letter K, for which they substituted the letter C. And they used this matrix, and they could rotate the letters in a way in which they were able to tap almost any kind of a message, often using an abbreviated form. For example, one of the early sign-offs that appears in almost all the messages was "God bless you," as they're messaging to one another. And the G would be in the second line, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It's second row and the second vertical column, so it would be a 2-2. The B would be 1-2, second row, first row across, second row down. And they got to the point where they could do this with almost kind of a blinding kind of a speed, and they were able to use this system of tapping either through the wall, or they could apply it, as Denton did, to sneezes and coughs, or even sweeping with a broom. There's a lot of humor in the book. It's black humor often, but they were sustained by humor, and they each would have kind of a signature sneeze in which they would, go bullshit, or worse, obscenities in their sneezes. They would typically garble the name Ho Chi Minh, and it would come out horseshit. One of their real nemeses was an Australian journalist named Wilfred Burchett, communist journalist, who was writing pieces around the world about how terrific the Vietnamese were and how evil and imperialistic the POWs and the American military was. And whenever they would be forced to read on the radio, I mentioned Al Brudno, he was one of those who would garble the sound of Wilfred Burchett's name. It would come out well-fed bullshit. There was a lot of that sort of thing. Carl Berg he's a Navy, I'm sure if Berg was Navy or Air Force, but he was noted for his humor and oftentimes would entertain the other POWs with various kinds of shtick or things that he would do. There was a guard who, on one occasion, a guard who wanted to learn some English and an English expression. And so Carl Berg decided to teach him an English expression. He said, whenever you get up in the morning and you want to say hello, and he knew some Vietnamese, he was explaining that hello is I'm queer. You say I'm queer. So this one guard was very proud of this English that he had learned, would get up in every morning for weeks, would go from cell to cell and say I'm queer, I'm queer. So it was the kind of hijinks, the kind of light touch that occasionally, in between torture, would lighten the mood and sustain them over a period of time. Probably the two worst torture cases would be the case of Edwin Atterbury and the case of Cobile. These are two Air Force POWs. Atterbury made a mistake of trying to escape with John Dramisi, another Air Force, I think Dramisi was an Air Force major. This would have been in 1969, spring of 1969. Atterbury and Dramisi had an elaborate escape plan, a good plan actually, although no one ended up successfully escaping from the north. You could escape from the prison maybe, but they would usually be able to find you after a short while. And Atterbury and Dramisi were captured soon after getting out of the zoo annex in the spring of '69, which turned out to be a terrible thing for the other prisoners who took tremendous punishment and retaliation. But the worst case was Atterbury, who was put in a torture cell. And I would say in the book, a description of what he underwent, the shrieks that were heard from the equivalent of blocks, several blocks, city blocks away. And he died in that torture cell. One of the very few cases where a man was tortured to death. And that was in direct retaliation for that escape effort. Dramisi also took terrible punishment but survived. And some of the other POWs took awful punishment. Gene McDaniel, Red McDaniel took 700 lashes. There was even some electroshock treatment, which they didn't usually resort to. Red continues to be very active on the MIA and the POW issue. McDaniel took tremendous punishment because he was a senior in the zoo area, in that complex. And the POWs assumed that all this had been orchestrated, that the Dramisi Atterbury escape had been organized and directed by the seniors, which really wasn't the case. Dramisi pretty much went on his own. And although he finally got the order that it was okay to go, there was a lot of reluctance on the part of, actually it was Conrad Troutman, who you mentioned earlier, who was a senior, who said, okay, you want to try it, go ahead. but there would always be the concern that if the guy didn't make it, or for that matter, even if he did make it, the repercussions for the guys that were left behind, who would be punished in retaliation for that. For 2 months, there was it was probably the worst sustained torture period. Would have been in the spring and summer of '69 at every one of the camps in the north. And again, there were these 4 or 5 main prisons. So not only the zoo and the zoo annex, but at Walla, at Noy Hilton, at the Plantation, Santé, and all the other camps in the north. The other case, the severe torture case, would have been Earl Cobile, who was a victim of what was called the Cuban program. The Fidel program, yeah. We still don't know exactly who Fidel was. It's one of the remaining mysteries of the POW story. We think that Fidel was a Cuban, a Spaniard of some type, probably Cuban from his appearance, from the language. Shows up one day along with an entourage of a few other Cubans, some of whom came a little bit later. Showed up at the zoo in, this would have been in 1967, 68, somewhere in there. Fidel shows up rather suddenly, and he's given all kinds of special deferential treatment by the Vietnamese. It's hard to tell whether he is considered a communist superior to the Vietnamese, or the Vietnamese are just indulging this foreign visitor. But he's given kind of free rein for about 2 months. Actually, the Cuban program would extend almost the course of a year, with about 20 POWs, 2 groups of, I think, 10 each, who were taken out of the zoo annex and put in a special part of the compound. And Fidel was able to, it's hard to tell exactly what the purpose of the program was. It appears that it was a program to kind of turn out Manchurian candidates for early release, to punish guys so severely and indoctrinate them to the extent that they could be prepped for early release and then would just recite the Vietnamese, the communist line when they got out. We're not sure exactly, again, we don't know the details of this program because no one has ever determined Fidel's identity or the Cubans' identity because they left after a year. And DIA analysts have been trying to track this guy for years, trying to locate him. All we know is that several of the POWs in this program, in particular Cobile, were viciously tortured in kind of an alternation of carrot and stick over a period of time. Cobile's mistake, this is Earl Cobile, Air Force major, I believe, was to be in bad shape to begin with, and Fidel assumed that Cobile was faking insanity. And he said, "We've got a faker here," and he just continued to beat the hell out of the guy in session after session until Cobile was mindless, was just completely numb, didn't know where he was, who he was, could not eat. He had to be force-fed by some of the others at the zoo, and he would die sometime later, about a year or 2 later, from what was one of the severest torture episodes. Well, solitary was the worst kind of solitary, with darkness in a small cell, often with vermin and rats and things that you could hear but could not see. Occasionally you might be let out for a half hour a day. The only break would be receiving food, usually 2 meals a day, around 10 o'clock and 3 o'clock. The longest that were held in solitary would have been probably the seniors Denton, Stockdale, and Risner. Ben Purcell, who was an Army major in the South, spent a long time in solitary. Ernie Brace, a civilian captured in Laos, also spent a long time in solitary. As much as anything, obviously, ability to cope, to distract yourself, to kill time, to or in some way to survive what Red McDaniel called the inner struggle, the mental struggle that all the POWs really had to go through. Torture occurred fairly regularly, but there were long periods in between where the real challenge was to mentally stay together and survive just the monotony of the routine and the boredom, and particularly in solitary. You use that time in solitary either to restore yourself physically by just kind of walking and pacing back and forth. Good question. I don't know. This is the cover that the Naval Institute Press chose to use. It is a photograph or a rendering of a photograph that appeared at the in an exhibit at the Capitol Building, I believe in 1970, that Ross Perot had organized. And I am not sure myself who that is. It is a worst-case scenario of obviously the prisoner who had undergone tremendous punishment and malnutrition. The book cost $36.50, I believe. Yeah. 700 pages, lots of illustrations, 50 pages of documentation, and a good read, as well as we think an expert analysis. That's a photograph of the POWs on one of the aircraft finally taking off from Hanoi in probably February or March 1973. They were stoic almost up to that point. They were told not to show any emotion until they got on the plane, not to give the Vietnamese any satisfaction, and they were also pretty enervated by that time. But that's a group that finally, when they realized they were leaving captivity, some of them perhaps after 7 or 8 years, just let it all out in absolute joy and elation. We did see the debriefings, not all of them, but many of them. We could not quote directly from them. Even in paraphrasing, we had to be very careful what we used. But the real value of the debriefings was in just kind of informing us and giving us a sense of what a Stockdale or a Risner had experienced, so that we could better judge their memoirs and the published literature. But the debriefings are considered confidential, and we respected that confidence, as well as even other POWs who want to see others' debriefings are not really allowed to get to use those. McCain was unquestionably a hard resistor, hard line, courageous, tremendous fortitude, just to have survived his initial injuries on his shoot-down. McCain landed in prison, landed in Hanoi after a shoot-down, in as probably bad a condition as any prisoner who survived a crash or a shoot-down, a bailout. He had a bad back, he had broken legs, arms, would be in cast for much of his captivity, in fact. He almost drowned, in fact, on landing in Hanoi, landed in a lake in the city, and with his equipment on. Somehow, despite his injuries, got out of the lake, ended up at the plantation, and would resist indoctrination and resisted interrogation. The Vietnamese knew that he was the son of an admiral, Admiral McCain in the Pacific. They knew they had a prize. They tried desperately to get him to tape or to write something that they could use for propaganda purposes. He refused. He was punished repeatedly. Somehow recovered from his injuries with the help of a couple cellmates who nursed him along, and would become one of the leaders in the resistance. We decided on Honor Bound just because it had captured both concepts of the captivity, their being bound, but also the importance of honor. That was the key thing, to retain your honor, to observe the code of conduct, and as their symbolic phrase was, to return with honor. Thank you for having me.